In lesson 3.3, we're getting a bunch of new properties. The first one we're going to look at are even and odd properties. So we know from algebra that when you plug in a negative x and you get positive f of x back out, so if the negative disappears, it's an even function. When you plug in negative x to a function and you get negative f of x, meaning the negative stays, it's an odd function. So what we see is if we plug in a positive and a negative for cosine, the positive or the negative goes away and becomes positive. So cosine's even. When you plug in a positive and a negative for sine, the negative will stay. So sine is odd. And so then we get these even and odd properties for sine and cosine. So if you don't have these written down, pause the video, get these new properties written down. Basically, it'll just show you what happens when you have a negative inside a function. If it's even, the negative goes away. If it's odd, the negative will go in front of each function. So go ahead and get those down, and we're going to talk about cofunctions next. Next, we're going to talk about cofunctions, which you can also think of as your complementary angle functions. So when we look at cosine of 90 minus 30, so that would be 60. 60 and 30 are complements of each other because they add up to 90 degrees. Well, cosine of 60 and sine of its complement equal the same thing. And so that happens for a bunch of functions. So cosine and sine of an angle equals cosine of its complement. Cosecant of an angle equals secant of its complement. Cotangent of an angle equals tangent of its complement. And then the opposite is also true. So go ahead, these are all in radian form. So you see pi over 2's and x's, and these are all in degree form, but they're the exact same properties. So go ahead and pause and get these down as well. The next set of properties we have are composite properties where you're subtracting or adding two angles inside the function. So if we have cosine of a minus b, if we have cosine of a minus b, we're going to have cosine a cosine b plus sine a sine b. Go ahead and write that down. When you're adding, you're going to have cosine a cosine b minus sine a sine b. For sines, the sines and cosines mix. So for sine a minus b, it'll be sine a cosine b minus cosine sine. For sine a plus b, you've got sine cosine plus cosine sine. They mix again. And then these are your two tangent functions. So go ahead, pause the video, get these written down, and then we'll move on to some examples. In example 1, this looks like a cofunction property. So if you go back and look at your cofunction table, you'll notice it looks like it because of the pi over 2. Only you'll see the problem is pi over 2 needs to be first. So if I want to switch this so that pi over 2 is first and it's positive, then I need to factor out a negative 1. And what that'll do is it'll make pi over 2 positive, and it'll make x negative. And now it's in the right order for cofunction. Only we have this negative now that we need to get rid of. So if we look at our even and odd properties, for sine, we see that sine is odd. So the negative moves in front, and that is using our odd property. So I'm able to move the negative in front, and now this is a cofunction property. And so this changes to cosine of x. And that is what they wanted us to show. So we factored out a negative. Then we used the odd property to move the negative in front. And then we used a cofunction property to change it into cosine. In example 2, we're going to look back at what we talked about in chapter 1. And we're going to remember that all students take calculus, tells us where the trig functions are positive in each quadrant. And then we're going to draw angles A and B in standard position using this information. They give us 2 pieces of information for A. They give us 2 pieces of information for B, and those help us narrow down which quadrant the angles should be drawn in. And then after we draw them, they want us to use our properties to evaluate sine of A minus B and cosine of A plus B. So we're going to go ahead and draw picture A and picture B in the correct quadrants using the info. So this says that sine of A is negative and cosine of A is positive because it says greater than 0. So I'm looking for where is cosine positive? That would be quadrants 1 and 4. And in which of those will sine be negative? And that would have to be quadrant 4. So here now I know that A is in quadrant 4. because that is where sine is negative, but cosine would be positive. Well, now let's find b, and then I'll label them. So this says tangent is negative, and the sine of b is positive, because greater than 0. So where is sine positive? Well, that would be quadrants 1 and 2. And since tangent's negative, we're going to have to go with quadrant 2, because everything's positive in quadrant 1. So that means A. So we have B drawn in quadrant 2. Now we're going to go through and label them. So we look at A, and it says sine is negative 2 over 3. Well, we know that sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so we can label the opposite with a 2 and the hypotenuse with a 3. Then we can use Pythagorean theorem to find the missing side. So we're going to have 4 plus x squared equals 9, subtract 4 to the other side, and we're going to get square root of 5. Then you want to label your B picture. So looking at B, it says tangent is opposite over adjacent. So you can label the opposite, you can label the adjacent, and then we're going to use Pythagorean theorem to find the hypotenuse. So 5 squared plus 6 squared equals the missing side squared. You're going to have 25 plus 36. You're going to get 61 and take the square root, so radical 61. So now we have our full pictures. 2 is going down, 6 is going left, so you need to put negatives on them. Now we have full pictures. We're going to use our properties and plug in numbers. So sine of A minus B is sine of A cosine B minus cosine A sine B. And this is a composite property, so go ahead and find it on your table. Now using the picture, we're going to fill in what we know.